My presentation today is about the transmission of one composition from the 13th century. This composition survives in 4 contemporary manuscripts, one of which you see here, open on the very folio where the piece is notated. It begins top left with a beautifully ornate red initial letter A for the word Alleluia. The text continues with the blue initial near the middle of the page, Ascendens Christus in altum. Alleluia Ascendens Christus was a plain chant for the Feast of Ascension, and that plain chant is quoted here as part of the polyphonic elaboration. On the left-hand page, you can see the beginning of the chant in the second stave from the top, the stave that has only 4 lines. The very top stave, the one that has 5 lines, presents a polyphonic countermelody, an elaborate melisma over the plain chant notes, each of which plain chant notes must have been sustained like a drone or an organ point. Actually, the term organ point goes back to the 13th century and refers to precisely the kind of polyphony you see here. Punctus organi in this period meant literally a section in melismatic organum, and that is what we have at the beginning of Alleluia Ascendens. Organum was a somewhat ambiguous word in this period, and it can refer to a number of things. In the broadest sense, organum could mean polyphony in general, polyphony of any kind whatsoever. But I will also be using the term here in 2 more specific senses. First, organum purum referred to the style of melismatic polyphony that I have just described. When a piece was written in that style, the word organum could also serve as a genre designation. Such a piece would be called an organum, as opposed to a conductus or a motet. And the piece I'm about to discuss today is an organum duplum, an organum for 2 voices. Of such organa dupla, close to 100 survive today, and as a corpus they are often referred to as the Magnus Liber Organi, the Great Book of Organum. This quite substantial repertory was reportedly composed by a master Leo or Leonin, and it is in that repertoire that the paradoxes mentioned in the title occur. Let me begin the presentation by explaining the question that is driving my research. The title says that we're going to deal with transmission, with the way music circulated in written form in the 13th century. But why would that even be interesting? And how does it relate to the larger historical picture? Let's go back to what I said a moment ago about that Magnus Liber Organi and Master Leonin. It is with these that our story must begin. Sometime in the late 13th century, somewhere in England, there was a man who wrote a music treatise that is unlike any other from this period. We don't know the author's name, but the name he has been given in the modern period has acquired so much resonance that we would probably continue to use it even if we did find out what he was called. He is, of course, the mysterious Anonymous 4. There are several things we can tell about this interesting figure. He probably wrote his treatise by dictating it to a scribe, not only because it was customary to do that in this period, but because the text contains all the peculiarities you would expect in a dictation. He must have had memory problems, possibly on account of advanced age, for Anonymous 4 had a curious tendency to wander off the point, and indeed to forget what point he had actually been making. Fortunately, the scribe just kept writing down whatever he said, and made no attempt later on to edit the text for relevance or consistency. I say fortunately, for it is these lengthy digressions that have proved of incomparable value to us today. It is in the course of one of his digressions that Anonymous 4 gives us what is possibly the most important piece of information. Magister Leonin was, as people used to say, an excellent organista, that is, a master of organum, who made a great book of organum, a Magnus Liber Organi, from the gradual and antiphonal for the increase of the divine service. This one sentence has become the cornerstone of our modern historiography of 13th century music. Although Anonymous 4 was writing in the late 13th century, scholars are agreed that Master Leonin must have lived about a century earlier, in the decades around 1200. Anonymous 4 knows nothing about the time before that, so I have kept it shrouded in darkness here. Yet he does say very interesting things about the time after Léonin. Let us see how he continues. And the great book was in use up to the time of Princeton the Great, who made an edition of it, and made many better clausulae or puncta. The book, or books of Master Princeton, were in use until the time of Master Robert de Sabilone, and in the choir of the major church of the Blessed Virgin in Paris, that is, Notre-Dame Cathedral, and from his time until the present day. With this, we seem to have the outlines of a lineage, a continuous tradition beginning with Léonin and his great book, continuing with Princeton and his apparent revision, and then onwards from Robert de Sabilone until the end of the 13th century. Anonymous 4 mentions several other names as well, but I've not indicated them here on the slide. Now, it's hard to be sure of the exact dates of any of these people, for none of them, except Franco of Cologne, whom you see at the very end, is known to us from other sources. But thanks to Anonymous 4, we have at least the outlines of a chronology. And we know that the Cathedral of Notre-Dame at Paris was one of the principal centers in which the entire tradition unfolded. All there is left to do for us as historians is match up this account with the surviving musical sources. And that is where problems begin. There are only 3 complete musical sources that predate the middle of the 13th century. In modern scholarship they are referred to by the shortest possible abbreviations you could think of, namely the first letters of the 2 places where they are kept today, Florence and Wolfenbüttel. W1, F, and W2 are the 3 central Notre Dame sources, and indeed they are of central importance to all research of 13th century music, including my own today. There is also a large number of fragmentary sources, likewise referred to with the shortest possible abbreviations. Such fragments may range from a few tiny snippets or strips to several sheets. They have mostly been recovered from books that were bound in the 15th and 16th centuries, and as you can see here, they bear all the signs of having been used as binding materials. The invention of printing in the 1440s may have been a great leap forward for European intellectual culture, yet it also vastly increased the demand for bookbinders. For them, the making of cheap bindings was at a premium, and you guessed it, they bought up useless old manuscripts by the cartloads, and proceeded to cut them up sheet by sheet and glue them in. Fortunately, diligent searching among bookbindings continues to lead to the discovery of new fragments even to this day. From the distribution of all these sources, complete and fragmentary, along our timeline, you can see that we are facing a major problem. None of the sources we have can be dated securely before the 1230s. Anonymous 4 may still have known about Léonin, and he may have seen sources from Léonin's time and even before. But for us there is nothing but darkness until about 1230. Everything that happened before that date we know about only thanks to Anonymous 4. It is he who assures us that a great book of Organa was made, probably by the late 12th century. Yet we have no firm idea as to what that book was like, how it was transmitted, how Princeton revised it, or indeed any of its history prior to that big dividing line. Why 1230? Is it just our bad fortune that no Ars Antiqua polyphony survives in sources older than this? Or had there been something going on around that time, something that we don't yet know about, but that somehow brought major changes to the way music was transmitted? If there is going to be an answer to these questions, there is only one place where we may expect to find it. It is in that aggregate of sources you see pressed together between the 1230s and 70s. It is in their mutual relationships, in the variant readings they share or that set them apart, that we may find clues to the older musical traditions they inherited. My aim today is to find out what such clues may reveal, and how they may change our broader understanding of how this musical culture functions. The inquiry will soon take us to the fine notational detail of musical texts, the level where we will almost literally need a magnifying glass. But since the findings on this level turn out to be quite paradoxical, we will just as quickly need to step back from that level and consider some very broad historical issues. To set up those broader issues in advance, I would like to dwell a little longer on the sources that survive today, the ones you see represented on the timeline. The three big ones in particular, that is W1, F and W2, will deserve a formal introduction. But let us begin with the fragments and the places where they are likely to have originated. The first thing we can tell about their geographical distribution is that we are dealing with an international musical culture. One of the remarkable things about that culture is its homogeneity, not just in repertoire or notation, but in codicology, in manuscript format. As I will discuss later on, the three complete sources, W1, F and W2, are very similar in format, layout and organization, as if they somehow conform to a standard type. And as far as we can tell, the fragments too must have come from manuscripts conforming to this type. No similar type was used for polyphony before or after the 13th century. This is a point that will become important later on. As I mentioned before, the three principal Notre-Dame sources owe their abbreviations to the places where they are kept today. W1 and W2 for Wolfenbüttel, and F for Florence. That the three sources have survived at all seems almost like a miracle in hindsight. In the case of the Wolfenbüttel manuscripts, we owe that miracle to a man who actually had no interest in polyphony whatsoever. Matthias Flacius Illyricus was a Lutheran reformer and theologian of a severely puritanical bent. For him there was only one useful thing about the old musical books that he had somehow managed to acquire. Quite a few of the compositions in them were set to lyrics that were scathingly critical of the Catholic Church. Flacius was intending to print these lyrics in a collection of old poems, a publication designed to prove that his own criticisms of Rome had been of long standing. His print actually came out in 1548, and it went through several editions and reprints. Fortunately, Flacius never discarded the manuscripts from which he had collected the texts, and to that marvellously good fortune we owe the survival of W1 and W2. How Flacius had come by the manuscripts is hard to tell, but it is certain that W1 came originally from Scotland, more particularly the Abbey and Cathedral of St. Andrews. Once upon a time, this had been one of the richest and most powerful religious houses in all of Scotland. But it was disbanded and stripped of its wealth in the 16th century, after which it proved useful to locals only as a good place to get free building stone. Today only ruins remain of what must once have been a glorious building. For a 13th century music manuscript, W1 is uncommonly plain. It is copied on low-quality parchment, sometimes with big holes that were crudely pasted over with parchment patches, with irregularly shaped sheets, as you can see in this image, and with initials that are ornamented in comparatively crude fashion. Yet what makes the manuscript crucially important to us is its early date. 20 years ago, Mark Everest demonstrated in a JAMS article that W1 was copied almost certainly in the 1230s, perhaps even early in that decade. So that is where we will place it on the timeline. F, the Florence manuscript, was a far more expensive source. With nearly 500 folios, it had more than twice the volume of W1. Every folio was beautifully copied and ornamented, and the major sections were provided with gorgeous illuminations in the famous Parisian workshop known as the Johannes Grusch Atelier. For several centuries the Florence manuscript was kept in the reading room of the Bibliotheca Medicea Laurentiana at Florence, in a building designed by none other than Michelangelo, completed in 1571. Like all manuscripts in this room, the Florence manuscript was chained to a bench where scholars could consult it at leisure. The particular bench for books on music was number 29. The word for bench was pluteo. So the odd shelf mark of the Florence manuscript, Pluteo 29.1, means simply bench 29, first book. The great value of the Florence manuscript lies not only in the massive repertoire it transmits, but also in the fact that it came from Paris, the very center of the 13th century musical world. Its date is agreed to be around 1245, about a decade later than W1. The last of the three Notre-Dame sources is W2. It is hard to tell where it originated, though northern France seems a good guess, since the manuscript contains a sizable repertory of French texted motets. Like Florence, it is beautifully copied and ornamented, though it's a little smaller and also less lavish in its execution. W2 is clearly later than F, and scholars have proposed dates from about 1250 to 1260. These, then, are the three principal Notre Dame sources, and they will play a central role in the discussion that follows. For our purposes, we will need to draw as well on one of the fragments, the manuscript Silos, discovered 30 years ago in the monastery of Santo Domingo de Silos in Spain. I visited Santo Domingo de Silos earlier this summer on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, and I cannot resist sharing with you a few of the pictures I took there. The Silos fragments consist of 4 leaves of Organa dupla, impossible to date with any accuracy. The particular versions of the Organa in Silos are close to those in F and W2, so I have placed it between them on the timeline. Back now to Alleluia Ascendens Christus, and back to the copy in the Florence manuscript. I have said earlier that punctus organi in this period meant a section of organum, and the whole Alleluia is indeed composed of sections. The first self-contained section is the entire stretch of music that it takes to sing just the first word Alleluia alone. Unfortunately, there is no modern recording of Alleluia Ascendens Christus, but I would like to play a little sample of the kind of melismatic polyphony we find in the opening section, taken from a different setting. The second section is written in the same style of Organum Purum, but after that we see a change in style. All of a sudden the plainchant notes are spaced much more closely together, and instead of the extended polyphonic melismas of Organum Purum, there are now at most 2 or 3 notes against each plainchant notes. This is the style known as discant, in which both voices move in a tightly regulated triple rhythm. In the following sample you can hear a typical passage of discant. To mark the change in style at this point, I have chosen to indicate sections in descant in blue, as opposed to the yellow for organum. And in this way the entire setting can be viewed as a chain of discrete sections, most of them in the style of organum purum, but some in descant. I have numbered them 1 through 11. A schematic representation allows us to visualize this structure in a more abstract format and to make a comparison between F and the other 3 sources. The abbreviations for the 4 sources are given on the left. You can see that there is only one disagreement between the sources. F is the only one that provides music for section 11, the second Alleluia invocation. Other than that, the 4 sources are in perfect agreement. For Organa dupla in the 13th century, that is actually quite unusual. In the large majority of cases, we find exactly the opposite. Organum sections that underwent continuous revision, rearrangement and recomposition as they traveled from one source to another. Sometimes a given organum might almost end up becoming a different piece altogether. But none of that in this case. The picture is one of uncommon textual stability. Such stability would seem to suggest a somewhat mechanical copying process. Scribes apparently aimed to produce exact duplicates of the setting as they found it before them, without revisions of any kind. We are bound to assume that the piece traveled and was copied as a complete musical whole. Given that there is none of the revision or recomposition that is so common in other organa, how are we to determine in what sorts of ways the sources are dependent on each other? There are in fact source variants to help us, but they are tiny, and we will have to find them with a magnifying glass. Mostly we are dealing with trivial changes in musical orthography, but occasionally also an extra note or a change in pitch. So let us take our magnifying glass and consider the very first section, section number 1. In this slide I've brought together the 4 manuscript copies of this section. To facilitate comparison, I have left out the plain chant tenor, so for now we are concentrating only on the top voice. I have remarked earlier upon the textual stability of Alleluia ascendens, and this figure completely bears that out. Not only is the music identical in all 4 sources, but there is unanimity even about minor details, such as notes or ligature shapes, even when such details have no apparent notational significance. We also find a gentle sprinkling of scribal variants, but most of these are of no use to us. If a variant is to be of help to our inquiry, there are 2 things we need to be sure of. The obvious and easy part is that it must be a variant, a reading that differs from another reading in another manuscript. The hard part is that it must have been transmitted, copied again and again in successive generations of manuscripts. To be sure of this, we need to find a variant in at least 2 sources. That would prove that it had traveled. But since we actually have only 4 sources, the conditions are even harder. In fact, we need to find a variant in exactly 2 sources. 1 is too few, for the reason I explained before. 3 is too many. That would leave only 1 copy with a different variant. And because this latter variant would be alone, we could never be sure that it had traveled. What we need, in short, is 2 against 2. The 3 variants highlighted here, labeled 1, 2 and 3, meet these criteria, for they are shared between pairs of sources. The variants are significant also for another reason. The readings vary with perfect synchronicity, perfect simultaneity between sources. When one changes, the others change at the same time. It is quite amazing to find such notational consistency between sources copied as far apart as Scotland, France, and Spain. Once again, it bears out the likelihood of mechanical copying. The specific pattern of variations allows us to posit two major branches in the transmission of the first section, one from which descended W1 and F, and another from which descended W2 and Silos. And with that, we now have a stemma. By itself, this stemma tells us little. There are only so many ways in which four copies can be seen to descend from a common ancestor, and most of those ways are variations of one another. One thing we can tell from the stemma, for example, is which readings are original and which came later. Yet the usefulness of the stemma lies in something else. The fact that we can be close to certain that this is how section 1 was transmitted. If some other piece of evidence comes along that contradicts this picture, we'll have good reason to insist that the stemma, at least, must be correct. Let us now add a major complication to the story. The plainchant melody used in Alleluia Ascendens Christus was not unique to that Alleluia in particular. The same melody was used on other days in the liturgical calendar, albeit with different words to suit whatever the liturgical occasion required. For example, the chant Alleluia Judicabunt Sancti for the Common of Martyrs has a different text, but is melodically identical with the Alleluia that we've just looked at. And it, too, was set to polyphony in an organum duplum, featuring an identical division in sections that alternate between organum and discant. Let's consider these two organa dupla side by side. The organum that we have already considered, Ascendens Christus, is shown on top. It is identified by the Ludwig number M23. Beneath it is the companion setting, Alleluia Judicabunt, with the Ludwig number M42. You can see that this latter organum survives in only 3 sources. One thing in this table is immediately of interest. The two organa have identical music for 3 sections, sections 1, 4, and 7 respectively. We have looked for tiny source variants in section 1, but only in M23. Now it turns out that there are 3 more copies of section 1 in another organum. Wouldn't it be interesting to find out how those copies relate to the picture we've established already? There are also 4 sections for which the two organa are perfectly consistent among themselves, but are unanimous in their disagreement from each other. These are sections 2, 6, 8, and 10. And finally, if we find something to which I already alluded earlier on, evidence of revision and rearrangement in the transmission of Alleluia Judicabunt Sancti. In sections 3, 5, and 9, we find that the sources for this organum disagree with each other. You can see that this concerns only the blues sections, the ones in discant. What we are witnessing here, of course, is the famous phenomenon of clausular substitution. Earlier on I remarked that organa must have travelled as musical wholes, subject to mechanical copying in the case of M23, and to revision and rearrangement in the case of M42. That can only mean that the two organa, M23 and M42, travelled independently. At the same time, they also must have a common origin, for they have the same music for 3 sections. So we could posit a stemma in which that common origin is reflected at the very top. This is a hypothetical stage at which the music for sections 1, 4, and 7 was either composed specially for both organa, or existed in one and was borrowed by the other. In that same stage, the two settings must also have gotten the sections that were unique to them and to which they were to hold on throughout their transmission. You can see that this simple explanation takes care of all the sections in organum purum marked in yellow. After this early stage, only the blue discant sections can tell us what happened next. In the case of M23, Alleluia Ascendens, they tell us nothing, because the sources remain in total agreement. But then we already have the stemma that we established a moment ago in section 1. So it seems that we now have the complete descent of M23 accounted for. In the case of its companion, Alleluia judicabunt, M42, the discant sections do seem to suggest a breaking up of the tradition. The right-hand branch splits up into several distinct twigs. All of this is hypothetical, of course. This entire stemma is premised on the assumption that Organa dupla traveled as complete musical wholes. If it is fair to assume that, then here in this stemma is how they might have parted ways after a common origin. Fortunately, we can test the assumption. A little while ago we compared tiny notational variants in section 1, and thereby arrived at the stemma shown in the grey box. Yet this same section 1 also survives in the 3 copies of M42 on the right. Surely, at least some of the variants we found in the left-hand branch are not going to occur in the right-hand branch, not if the organa had firmly parted ways long before. Surely, too, the right-hand branch will see the introduction of quite different source variants that will be distinctive to that side of the textual tradition. In short, we now have an opportunity to verify objectively whether the big stemma before you is correct. Let us see what the evidence will tell us. Here's a surprise. All our predictions are flatly contradicted. Look at M42, Alleluia judicabunt, as it survives in the various sources. At no point does it introduce source variants that are peculiar to this organum alone, and that set it apart from its companion M23. On the contrary, whatever source it's in, it happens to share exactly the same variants as M23 in the same source, and it disagrees from other sources in exactly the same way as does M23. To all intents and purposes, the two organa behave not as if they were two different pieces that had gone their separate ways a long time ago and had accumulated distinctive variants in the process, but as if they were one and the same piece, introducing the same variants at the same points. But that is impossible. The organa are transmitted as quite separate pieces in every manuscript, sometimes at the remove of a dozen or more folios. They are not one and the same piece. Each has musical sections that are distinct to it, that confirm it had a separate transmission of its own. How could either organum have held on to its own distinctive sections unless it was transmitted as an independent piece, exactly as we find it now? This is the central paradox of which my title speaks. We have two organa that, depending on which sections you look at, behave either as separate pieces or as one and the same piece. This is something I have found in other organa as well, for example M8 and M26, which are also companion pieces. And the phenomenon as such must be more widespread even than that. Even in other genres, like the motet or the clausula, I have found puzzling examples of non-uniform transmission. The evidence must be trying to tell us something. But what is it? How do we resolve the paradox? At this point I propose to take a little detour and to consider these same issues in a textual culture that would at first sight appear to have little in common with the ars antiqua. I am talking about the plays of Shakespeare. It is well known that there are no autographed manuscripts for the plays of Shakespeare, no copies that we positively know were written by the author himself. The only sources we have are prints. During the poet's lifetime, individual plays appeared in small quarto-size prints. Soon after his death, his collected theatrical work, altogether 36 plays, came out in a massive 900-page volume in folio size. This, of course, is the famous First Folio of 1623. Prints like these are the only sources we have, yet they are far from ideal. We are talking, after all, about plays that were created for live performance, about shows before a live audience. But what we have is books intended for a readership, meant to be savoured, as it were, during a quiet afternoon in the armchair. Those printed books are closer to the world of the library than they are to that of the theatre, closer to a reader than to a spectator. The first folio is a commemorative collection. It preserves as many of Shakespeare's plays as possible, neatly orders them in tragedies, histories, and comedies, and it presents these in a convenient, readable format. What the first folio is emphatically not is a source for practical use. It would have been useless in the theatre, except perhaps as a library copy. When Shakespeare wrote the original plays, the needs of readers, of buyers of books, would have been of little concern to him. As an actor, he needed to produce materials that could be used in the staging of a live production by a professional crew of several dozen theatre personnel. None of those materials have survived, at least not for Shakespeare's plays. Yet in a recent monograph entitled Documents of Performance in Early Modern England, Professor Tiffany Stern of Oxford University has assembled a wealth of evidence to tell us what those materials were like. The first thing that transpires from a book is that there was a variety of them, and that they were copied in a variety of formats. There were the actors' parts. There was the prompter's book. There were sheets of music for singers and instrumentalists. There were the scrolls and letters that were brought as props on the stage. There were prologues and epilogues for one-time occasions. There was the playbook that was to be submitted to the master of the revels. And the list goes on and on. Any printer who thought of publishing a Shakespeare play would have needed, first of all, to acquire as many of those materials as possible, and second, to find an editor who could hammer them into some kind of readable shape. The critical point here is that prior to their publication, plays did not exist in the neatly edited form that we are familiar with today. They did not exist as textual wholes. They lived divided over a variety of practical documents, documents made for a variety of productions, and were not destined to come together in a single document unless and until a printer saw a market for them. Tiffany Stern drew attention to many textual inconsistencies, both within prints and between them, that have their origin in this multiplicity of documents. Let's quickly consider two examples from her book. In Shakespeare's first folio, Measure for Measure is printed with a list of characters that doesn't match the text of the play itself. The Duke is named Vincentio, a name which doesn't occur in the play. The names of Justus and Varius are omitted. Lucio is called a fantastique, and Pompey is referred to simply as clown. These are odd discrepancies, and it is especially odd to find them in immediate juxtaposition. Yet the discrepancies make sense when it is realized that the list of characters was typically copied in a separate document known as the plot. The editors of the first folio must have combined the plot of one production with the dialogues of another. Similarly, the 1622 quarto of Othello completely omits Desdemona's willow song in Act 4. At the particular point, marked by the red triangle on the left, Desdemona utters two phrases, "Will not go from my mind," and "Hark, who's that knocks?" printed as one poetic line. A year later, the editors of the first folio separated these half-lines through the insertion of additional dialogue plus the full lyrics of the willow song. The discrepancy is not hard to explain. The song and its lyrics had never been copied together with the dialogue, but must have been written on a separate document, a musical source, one to which the editors of the 1622 quarto had no access. The upshot of all this is that the plays as we have them are editions, far removed from Shakespeare's autographs. They are artificial products, created for readers while being based on materials from the theatre. We find them now as poetic wholes, but that doesn't mean they necessarily existed in that form during the long journey from theatre to printing house. It is their multiple transmission, in a variety of often quite ephemeral documents, that accounts for textual discrepancies with which the early editors either overlooked or were unable to resolve. To translate this into more general terms, something that is presented to us as an entity, as a musical whole, may still behave in contradictory ways if it was put together from different sources. Those contradictory ways may be the only clues we have to the existence of such different sources. If we are lucky, they may even tell us what those sources were like. In the case of 13th century polyphony, the paradoxes we have run into might conceivably allow us to take a peek into the darkness before 1230. After the detour into Shakespeare's studies, we may now return to the problems in the 13th century with a new question. Are the sources we have, are the Notre-Dame manuscripts, more like those practical materials that were created and used by theatre companies, or were they more like the first folio that was produced for a market of readers? The answer to that question is unambiguous. As I mentioned before, the sources we have appear to conform to a standard format, and that format happens to have much in common with the first folio. The Notre-Dame manuscripts are not practical sources at all, and they leave wide open the question what practical sources in this period would have looked like. The evidence for this is not new, but we do need to review it briefly, since it will clarify what a practical source would probably look like if we encountered one. The three central Notre-Dame manuscripts W1, F and W2 are far removed from practical needs of musicians. They are retrospective anthologies, created not just to preserve historic repertory, but to impose bibliographic order on it, to arrange it in suitable categories, and to present it in the most neatly written and lavishly decorated fashion possible. Consider this graphic representation. It shows, for each of the three manuscripts, how it is divided into sections, going from first page at the top to the last page at the bottom. The various sections are shown here in proportion to the number of pages, and they are color-coded to clarify the bibliographic order imposed on the repertory. Essentially, there are three categories. The first category, with the color spectrum from yellow to red, contains melismatic polyphony over sustained plainchant notes in 2, 3 or 4 voices. The scribes arranged this repertory according to number of voices, 4, 2, 3. After this, each of these sections was organized internally according to the liturgical calendar. It is a classification system worthy of a library. The next category is the conductus, coded green here, and once again divided according to number of voices. Then there are the Latin texted motets, coded blue, which are found only in F and W2. Once again the music is arranged by number of voice parts. W2 adds a sizable collection of French texted motets, once again arranged by number of voice parts. In this latter manuscript there is a further subdivision into groups of motets that are arranged in alphabetical order. Finally, W1 and F both contain monophonic songs in grey at or near the end. This, in sum, is the basic pattern of organization, and you can see that each manuscript religiously adheres to it, as if proper classification was at least as important to the scribes as preservation. It reminds us of the way the first folio divides up the plays of Shakespeare into comedies, tragedies, and histories. There is yet another, but far more telling indication that we are not dealing with practical sources here. Look at these pages in the motet section of F. They show us the beginning of a 3-part motet, whose title I have given at the top of the slide. Yet all we are seeing here of the motet is the top voice, or triplum, from beginning to end, and framed in the blue box, and a little bit of the middle voice, or motetus, in the red box. As soon as the motetus has gone through the music written here, it will need to turn the page, even though that will make it impossible for the top part to continue singing. But then if this motet was really to be performed in 3 voices, it would have been impossible for the top part to be sung anyway, for the third and most important part, the tenor, is found only after you turn the page, in the purple box. In short, the motet is unperformable from this manuscript. It is notated, yes, but you'll need to make another copy if you want to be able to sing it. All this may seem strange, as if this were the accidental oversight of a scribe. Yet it's surprising how many 13th century musical sources allow this to happen on a regular basis, as if it were totally natural for a musical source to not allow music to be sight-read. As if these arguments were not yet compelling enough, there is a third and possibly decisive argument: the uncommonly small size of the manuscripts. F has the size roughly of a trade paperback. I've compared it here with the Rhizome volume for polyphony from the 11th to 14th centuries. But F is actually one of the largest sources. W2, for example, is no bigger than Capelli's famous Dizionario di abbreviature latine et italiane. It is almost literally a pocket book. Add to this the factor of 13th century mise en page or page layout. F may have the size of a trade paperback, but only about a third of each page is actually set aside for the copying of music. The rest is blank space for annotations or for decorations. In W2, the writing space is only slightly bigger relative to the whole page, about 40%. So you could literally say that the writing area in Notre-Dame manuscripts is no bigger than a postcard. And within that postcard-sized rectangle, it seems, the scribe attempted to make up for the loss of space by cramming as many tiny notes in the page as possible. The particular example you see here, the beginning of Alleluia Ascendens, contains the equivalent of 520 notes in modern notation. It is hard to imagine that page size and page format were determined here by the needs of musicians rather than readers. When we take other sources into account, we'll see that F and W2 are actually still on the big side. We would need a big crystal pen to give an indication of the size of even smaller manuscripts. We end up, in short, with books so small that they could literally be taken away in your coat pocket. They are unfeasibly small for performance in church or in other venues. These manuscripts must have been designed for private use, perhaps in a personal library, and clearly it was important that they could be carried while traveling. It is probably no coincidence that the only archival references we have to the existence of these books concern manuscripts that were either privately owned or kept in a library. If we now return to the question, why 1230, one answer, that is admittedly speculative, but seems in context quite reasonable, could be this. 1230 is the approximate date when this standard format of music book became established. Since most of the Notre-Dame manuscripts are precious luxury objects, in beautiful calligraphy and with elaborate ornamentation, their chances of survival were significantly higher than those of manuscripts used in everyday performance, just as we have many prints of Shakespeare, but none of the manuscript materials that were used in the theatre. 1230 does indeed seem a reasonable date, because it coincides neatly with the development of so-called aids to study in the early 13th century, that is, research tools, means of classifying and ordering information that were developed for the benefit of clerics and scholars in the shape of proverb collections, concordances, florilegia, and so on. According to Richard Rouse, who has published most extensively on this subject, these efforts can be traced back to the 1240s or thereabouts, and we can clearly see their influence in the Notre-Dame sources. But if all this is true, then what would the original practical sources have looked like? Were they big, as one might expect in a textual tradition that goes back to a Magnus Liber Organi? Would they have had different page layouts? Would motets have been copied in a way that allowed them to be performed at sight? And is there a possibility that the paradoxes of transmission that we ran into earlier provide a glimpse of those lost sources? If so, what does that glimpse reveal? I'm afraid we must go to a much later period to get some sense of what a practical musical source in the 13th century looked like. If you consider the famous Montpellier manuscript from around 1280 and compare it with F, it does not initially look unusual in any way. In fact, it is very similar in size and layout to W2. But look at the actual notes, and you'll see that the practical needs of singers must have been a major consideration in the copying of this source. The notes are as big as we would print them in a practical edition today. The piece you see here is the famous great triplum Alleluia Nativitas by Master Peretinus the Great. The same great triplum is shown on the left in the Florence manuscript, but written in notes so small that it would be hard to sing the piece straight off the page. I will play a brief sample of it now. Here is another opening from the Montpellier manuscript. Remember that motet in F that was unperformable because its various voice parts, copied successively, were distributed over different openings. Well, here is the same motet. In the meantime, it has actually even been expanded to a 4-voice piece. But the scribe has made absolutely sure that all 4 singers can read the music simultaneously from the manuscript, and in fact it goes on exactly like this in the next opening. Montpellier is a late source from around 1280, and it need not tell us much about practical sources that were in use more than 50 years previously. The only useful thing it confirms is that notes must be big and that all voice parts must be visible in the same opening. Apart from that, Montpellier does not actually look like a practical source. It too is a comprehensive collection. In fact, with nearly 400 folios, it is the single largest collection of motets from the entire 13th century. It is lavishly illuminated and decorated, and it clearly is a reference work, except that it is much easier to sing from. Still, there is one avenue of inquiry that we haven't tried: pictorial evidence. Aren't there any illuminations from this period that show singers performing from manuscripts which for that very reason must be practical sources? Yes, there are, and as a matter of fact, some of those illuminations survive in Notre-Dame sources, the very sources whose repertoire is at issue here. Here is an illuminated initial from the manuscript W2. 3 singers standing before a lectern, one of them holding a music manuscript that must clearly be quite big. Bigger, at any rate, than the pocket-sized Notre-Dame sources, and quite a lot bigger than W2 itself. Later on in the same manuscript we find a very similar image, now with 4 singers, and once again the music book on the lectern is quite big relative to the singers' hands. Several decades after W2, The Montpellier manuscript shows an almost identical scene on its opening folio. And here, likewise, there can be no doubt that the music book must be bigger than Montpellier itself. It is only further on in Montpellier, at the beginning of the 8th gathering, that we find something that could conceivably be described as a pocket book. All this is fascinating evidence, and the fact that these illuminations are found in sources of polyphony is obviously a compelling circumstance. Yet there are some problems here. Illuminators may be great artists, but their job was to paint initials for a variety of manuscripts. Bibles today, Aristotle tomorrow, sermons the day after that, and just once in a long while a manuscript with polyphony. Whenever they were asked to illuminate a musical source, I am sure they could provide something that looked quite suitable. But whether they actually went to the trouble of observing and faithfully depicting polyphonic practice is another question. A quick look through non-musical manuscripts from the 13th century shows that 3 singers before a lectern was something of a standard topos. Every illuminator must have had this topos in his repertory. In fact, illuminators were regularly expected to produce this sort of image for the opening initial C for Cantate Domino in Psalm 97. One of the things that strikes me about these images is that the singers are so rarely looking at the book. Usually their eyes are turned upwards as if in prayer. The book is there, but the singers do not seem to rely on it for purposes of sight reading. This, at least, seems to be different in the first Montpellier image, where the lead singer appears to be looking intently upon the book. And yet, the resemblance with some of the generic Cantate Domino images is so striking as to make one almost suspect that they might be by the same artist, as here. Evidently, the illuminator was drawing on stock conventions, and not concerned to depict polyphonic practice from personal observation. Illuminations like these are of questionable value to our inquiry. It is only by rare exception that we find an illumination that does probably represent polyphonic practice. Here is an example to which Christopher Page, more than a decade ago, devoted an article in Early Music. There can be little doubt that what we see in this image is a performance of polyphony, for the illuminator took special pains to write the lyrics of an early 14th century motet on the scroll. It does indeed appear that we are in a different musical world. Instead of the usual blank expression of your average cleric, we now see faces twisted with intensity, raised eyebrows, tensed mouths and cheeks, wide eyes, and ears cupped in an effort to get the resonance and tuning just right. We can recognize this as polyphony partly because there are traditions of medieval polyphony that have survived in the Mediterranean until the present day, traditions in which singers typically conduct themselves in this very fashion. A good example is the traditional polyphony from the island of Corsica, an example that needs to be heard as well as seen. In this particular case from Corsica, we are dealing with an oral tradition. The singers in our illumination were performing, interestingly, from a scroll, not a book. In fact, one of the singers was holding an extra scroll in his hand, as though they were singing several motets in succession. There are still some scrolls of polyphony from the 13th and 14th centuries, and of these the most famous is the so-called Brussels Rotulus. Unfortunately, it is much too late to allow conclusions about Notre-Dame polyphony, but if you set it beside the Florence manuscript, you'll notice, what was in any case to be expected of a practical source like this, namely that the notes are big enough to allow performance at sight. It is nothing less than a miracle that the Brussels Rotulus has survived, because the odds of such ephemeral sources being preserved are close to negligible. Yet the scroll does underline, along with the illumination of the three motet singers, that practical sources need not necessarily have been books at all. In fact, I think that is quite unlikely. For the daily exigencies of cathedral and church, sheet music would have been far more practical. There is another similar source which bears out this point. It is not a scroll, but rather a sheet, a single bifolio. It is now bound into a book, but it must once have been created, used and circulated as a self-contained textual unit. Significantly, this sheet turns out to be absolutely huge. Its writing area alone is large enough to swallow up the Florence manuscript in its entirety. The manuscript is too big to fit our screen, so we need to resize our images to get some idea of what it looks like in its entirety. The notation in this source also turns out to be extraordinarily large, larger even than it is in the Montpellier manuscript. But most interestingly, it is a single sheet of parchment, a bifolium, with no notation on the outer pages. In format, it is really like a piece of sheet music from the 19th century. That it survives at all is due to a lucky circumstance. The bifolium was bound into a liturgical manuscript, now in the Vatican, and this is where Kenneth Levy found it more than 40 years ago. What we have before us is the organum about which Levy wrote his famous Jams article, A Dominican Organum Duplum. Let us now return to the question we started out with. We are concerned with the early transmission of Notre-Dame organum, and especially with the practical sources that must once have existed. We have now seen some very promising examples of manuscripts that were clearly designed for practical use, but they date from the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Can we take these as representative of the kinds of practical sources that were around before about 1230? In some ways I think yes, but in others definitely no. On the one hand, I think there is no question that much of the early transmission of organum duplum must have been by way of scrolls and loose sheets, and I wouldn't rule out that it was sources of this kind from which the Notre-Dame manuscripts were compiled. On the other hand, I don't think these earlier sources were necessarily big or contained large musical notation. In fact, I very much doubt it. Remember how I talked about the Montpellier manuscript a moment ago, how large the notes were compared to those in F, and how rationally the motet parts were laid out on the page. These features are not unique to Montpellier alone, but are found in numerous sources copied after about 1260. In fact, they would soon become the standard way of copying any polyphony at all. Large notes and rational motet layout are innovations that had one concern in common. They were specifically designed to enable or facilitate sight reading, singing music directly from the page. In fact, they are closely linked with a third innovation which also reflects the concern with sight reading. This is the notational teachings of Johannes de Garlandia and those developed in his wake by such figures as Lambertus and Franco. Ligatures with upward stems or with oblique endings are rhythmically unambiguous and can be read without difficulty or confusion. As far as I know, every 13th century source that systematically applies these teachings also has significantly larger notes than the Notre-Dame manuscripts, and will in most cases present motets in a rational page layout. There is an almost clean break between sources that have these three innovations, usually they do indeed occur together, and those that don't. Evidently, there was a fundamental change in thinking about musical notation around 1260, a change rooted in the novel idea that it should be possible to sing polyphony at sight immediately, even if you have never seen the piece before. We take this for granted now, but contemporaries regarded it as a revolution. Several decades later, Anonymous 4 would still remember what a sea change Garlandia had brought about. In olden days, he said, you might need as much as 7 hours to work out the rhythm of a notated piece, but today you can do it in less than 1. For Anonymous 4, the idea of a practical source has become synonymous with sight reading. But sources can be practical without necessarily allowing sight reading. Consider once again the analogy with Shakespeare. Actors' parts in Shakespeare's time contained only the texts that the actor was to memorize, with nothing more than cues to indicate the lines of other actors. The parts did not contain the whole play. That would have been a waste of ink and paper. Actors' parts were practical sources in that they were used to prepare a practical performance. But of course they were not practical in the sense that the actor needed to read from them on the stage. If they had been sources in this latter sense, then of course they would have had to be big and the writing would have had to be large and legible. But since actors' parts were used only for memorization, they might be as carelessly written and small as a grocery list. So now we are getting a clearer historical picture. There was a fundamental change around 1230, when the typical format of the Notre-Dame manuscripts was established. This format lasted about 30 years. Around 1260 there came another fundamental change with the invention of a new format that was specifically designed to enable sight reading. Unfortunately, we still don't know anything about the formats that had been current before 1230. But as I suggested earlier, the paradoxes of transmission may offer us a clue. And it is that clue that I wish to follow up in the final section of my paper. Let us go back to the Alleluia that we started out with. Remember how I said that depending on which sections you looked at, Organa behaved either as separate pieces or as one and the same piece. When they behave as one and the same piece, like here in the Florence manuscript, it can only be because they travelled as one piece, on one sheet of parchment, if perhaps with double text underlay, to allow them to be used in more than one organum. That one sheet is shown here as a hypothetical exemplar, from which the F-scribe must have fashioned the two organa as we know them today. This would account for the variance shared by the organa, the fact that they behave as one piece. There really is no other way to resolve the paradox. It follows that what we should try to reconstruct is not the transmission of the two organa, but of the source they have in common, a source which I now assume was a practical one, not a big tome like the Florence manuscript itself. It is that transmission, more compact, more piecemeal probably, that must have reached the scribe of W1 as well, where it likewise led to the fashioning of two separate organa. What this means is exactly what it meant in Shakespeare. Before the organa were copied in the Notre-Dame manuscripts, they did not exist as the musical wholes as we now know them. The various sections must have been contained in a variety of sources, from which the editors of the Notre-Dame manuscripts made a judicious selection in order to fashion the whole pieces needed by their clients. This would also explain the phenomenon known as clausula substitution. It is not that one clausula was ever literally substituted by another, but rather that one scribe made a different choice of discant section than another. In fact, although I cannot prove it right now, and although I certainly don't have time to present the circumstantial evidence I do have, my working model at the moment is that organa were compiled essentially from two types of sources. Sources for organum purum on the one hand, and sources for discant on the other. It is these sources, I think, that travelled from scribe to scribe, and it is these sources from which scribes probably fashioned the neat copies of their organa, making selections alternatively from one and the other. All this would explain how two organa can behave like separate pieces in one respect, and as one and the same piece in another. It is because even in edited form, they continue to reflect the behavior of the different sources from which they were compiled. This is the working model I hope to refine in future by examining the vast numbers of Organa dupla that remain to be studied. The working model does leave many questions. For one thing, what remains now of that Magnus Liber Organi? How can it be true what Anonymous Force said, that the Magnus Liber was passed on and revised in a continuous tradition from the late 12th to late 13th centuries? Why would Organum and Discant have been notated in separate sources? And most intriguing of all, what does this tentative picture suggest about the vexed question of which came first, clausula or motet? When it comes to these and many other questions, I feel that I have barely scratched the surface of what will hopefully prove to be a more revealing picture of the development of 13th century polyphony. Thank you.